Good evening, dear friends, and a very warm welcome to each and every one of you. Wherever you're listening from tonight, maybe tucked safely under the blankets, curled up in your favorite quiet corner of the house, or perhaps lying somewhere peaceful while the world slowly quiets down outside. I'm so happy you're here with me. Take a slow, gentle breath in. Let your shoulders soften and drop. Maybe pull the blanket or duvet up just a little higher and allow the day to quietly drift away. Imagine yourself settling into a soft armchair as evening gently falls. The room is quiet, perhaps with only the faint tick of a clock and the warmth of a lamp nearby. In your hands, you hold a warm cup of tea, chamomile, maybe, or whatever soothes you best. Let the steam rise slowly, carrying away the day's little worries. Tonight, need we have a calm mystery for you, one that unfolds like a familiar conversation among old friends. It's gentle, thoughtful, and meant to ease you toward peaceful sleep. Chapter 1: The Quiet Beginning. In the small sheltered village of St. Mary Mead, time seemed to observe a gentler calendar than the rest of the world. The seasons arrived without hurry. Spring unfurled slowly in pale primroses along the hedgerows. Summer lingered in long golden afternoons. Autumn brought the soft rustle of falling leaves across quiet lanes, and winter wrapped everything in a hush of frost and early twilight. People here moved to the rhythm of church bells, the chime of the hour from the old tower, and the steady tread of the postman who had walked the same route for 43 years without once missing a morning. On one such ordinary afternoon in late September, when the air carried the faintest scent of wood smoke and ripening blackberries, Miss Jane Marple sat in the wicker chair beneath the spreading branches of her ancient apple tree. The tree was old, older than the house, some said, and its fruit, though small and tart, made the very best of jelly when the time came. Miss Marple wore her favorite soft grey tweed skirt and cardigan, the sleeves slightly turned back at the wrists, and a pair of sensible low-heeled shoes that had seen many a village path. At her side rested a work basket, lined with pale blue cotton. Inside lay a half-finished pair of bed socks in thick cream wool, intended for the elderly Mrs. Bantry at the Hall, whose feet always felt the cold first, no matter how high the fire was banked. She had intended to knit. Truly she had. The needles were in her lap, the wool neatly wound, yet her hands remained still. Instead, she watched the lane beyond her low garden wall with the quiet, patient attention of someone who has learned that most things worth knowing reveal themselves if one simply waits long enough and looks in the right direction. The postman, Mr. Beddoes, came into view just as the church clock struck 3. He wore his familiar peaked cap and carried the leather satchel slung across his shoulder in the same way he had done since he was a young man home from the war. He paused at each gate, sorted the letters with practiced fingers, and placed them carefully in the boxes or pushed them through the brass letter flaps. When he reached Miss Marple's cottage, he lifted the latch of the little gate, stepped inside with the politeness of long acquaintance. He untouched the brim of his cap. "Afternoon, Miss Marple. Fine weather for the time of year." "Very pleasant, Mr. Beddoes," she replied, her voice soft and clear. "And how is your wife's knee today?" "Better, ma'am. Thank you for asking. The liniment from the chemist seems to be doing the trick. She sends her regards." He handed her 4 envelopes, 2 circulars, a bill from the drapers in much Benham, and 1 letter in a pale blue envelope, addressed in a hand that trembled just enough to suggest age and care. Miss Marple recognized it at once. The writing belonged to Mrs. Eleanor Grayson, an old friend who lived in the neighboring village of Lower Loxley, some 4 miles away by the footpath over the fields. Mr. Beddoes touched his cap again and continued on his way. Miss Marple remained seated for a few minutes longer, on watching the light filter through the apple leaves in small shifting patterns across the grass. Only when the postman had disappeared around the bend did she open the blue envelope with the small silver paper knife she kept in her basket for just such purposes. The letter was not long, but it was written with the sort of thoughtful precision that spoke of several drafts before the final copy. My dear Jane, I hope this finds you well, and that the garden is still giving you pleasure. The dahlias here have been particularly fine this year, though the slugs seem determined to claim half of them. I am writing because I find myself a little troubled in mind, and you have always had a way of seeing clearly where others see only shadows. My niece Clara, you remember her, I am sure, though she was only a girl when last you saw her regularly, has become engaged. His name is Thomas Hill, a solicitor who recently returned to the district after many years away. He is 42, steady, kind, and clearly devoted to her. Clara is 38 now, and though she has never spoken of wishing for marriage, she seems content, almost relieved, one might say, to accept this gentle arrangement. The wedding is planned quietly for the spring, nothing ostentatious, just a small service and tea at the house. Yet something in her manner gives me pause. When she speaks of love or of the future, there is a faint distance in her eyes, as though she were looking not at what lies ahead, but at something long left behind. She speaks of love the way one might speak of a garden one once tended with joy, only to walk away from it forever. And I cannot help wondering whether an old disappointment still lingers somewhere in her heart, quietly refusing to fade. I know it is perhaps nothing, a fancy of an old woman who has seen too many seasons pass. But if you should find yourself with a free afternoon, a visit would be most welcome. Clara always liked you, and your company is always soothing. With fondest regards, Eleanor Miss Marple read the letter twice, then folded it carefully and returned it to its envelope. She sat for some time longer, the paper knife resting lightly against her palm. Clara Grayson? She could picture her still, a slender girl with serious eyes and a habit of listening more than she spoke. Even as a child, she had been reserved in matters of the heart, quick to notice the feelings of others, yet slow to reveal her own. Miss Marple remembered a summer fete many years ago when Clara, then perhaps 17, had stood apart from the dancing, watching with quiet interest, but never joining in. The phrase spurned lover had not appeared in Mrs. Grayson's letter, yet it drifted into Miss Marple's thoughts as naturally as the scent of late roses carried on the breeze. Not in any dramatic sense, no grand betrayal or public scandal, but in the small private way that life sometimes turns away from what one had hoped for most. She looked up at the sky, pale and clear, with just a trace of evening gold beginning to gather at the horizon. A short visit to Lower Loxley would be pleasant, she decided. The footpath was easy at this time of year, the blackberries ripe enough to pick a handful along the way, and nothing soothed the spirit quite like a cup of tea shared among old friends on a quiet afternoon. Miss Marple rose slowly, brushed a stray leaf from her skirt, and carried the letter indoors. She would write a reply this evening, promising to come within the week. In the meantime, there was knitting to finish, supper to prepare, and the gentle business of an ordinary day to see through to its peaceful close. Chapter 2. Something slightly unusual. The following morning dawned soft and still, the kind of September day that feels like a gentle apology for the summer that has slipped away. Miss Marple rose early, as was her habit, and spent the first quiet hour tending to small household matters, watering the pots of geraniums on the windowsill, polishing the brass kettle until it caught the light like a small sun, and arranging a few late roses from the garden in a plain white jug for the breakfast table. She ate her toast and marmalade slowly, listening to the distant clatter of milk bottles being set down on doorsteps along the lane. By 10 o'clock, she had written a short note to Mrs. Grayson. "I shall walk over this afternoon if it suits. Expect me around 3. And posted it with young Tommy Pierce, who was passing on his bicycle. Then, with a small picnic tin containing 2 slices of seed cake wrapped in greaseproof paper and a thermos of tea, she set off along the footpath to Lower Loxley. The path wound pleasantly between fields still green from the late rains, bordered on one side by a low hawthorn hedge, heavy with haws, on the other by a shallow brook that murmured over smooth stones. Blackberries hung dark and ripe within easy reach. Miss Marple picked a small handful as she walked, eating them thoughtfully, their sweetness tempered by the faintest sharpness of autumn. She wore a light coat against the breeze and carried her stick, not for support, but because the handle was carved in the shape of a parrot's head and had been a gift from a nephew many years before. Lower Loxley lay nestled in a shallow dip of the hills, its cottages clustered around a small green where a single chestnut tree stood, already beginning to drop the first of its conkers. Mrs. Grayson's house, Rose Cottage, stood at the far end, its thatched roof newly repaired the previous year, its front garden bright with dahlias in every shade of pink, crimson, and apricot. Smoke rose in a thin blue thread from the chimney, promising a fire in the grate, even on so mild a day. Mrs. Grayson opened the door before Miss Marple could knock. She was a small, upright woman in her late 70s, her white hair neatly pinned, her eyes bright behind rimless spectacles. "Jane, my dear, you've come at exactly the right moment. Clara is just putting the kettle on." They embraced lightly, the way old friends do, and Miss Marple was ushered into the sitting room, where a low fire burned behind a brass fender. The room smelled of lavender and beeswax polish. Sunlight lay in warm rectangles across the faded turkey carpet. On the table stood a vase of white daisies and a few sprigs of lavender, freshly arranged. Clara appeared from the kitchen carrying a tray. She had changed little since girlhood. Still slender, yet still with that same quiet grace. But the years had softened her features and added a faint tracery of lines at the corners of her eyes. Her hair, once dark brown, was now threaded with silver, worn in a loose knot at the nape of her neck. She wore a simple cotton dress in pale blue, an apron tied over it, and smiled with genuine warmth as she set the tray down. "Miss Marple, how lovely to see you. It's been far too long." They settled into comfortable chairs around the fire. Mrs. Grayson poured the tea with the small ceremony that belongs to such occasions. Milk first for Miss Marple, lemon for herself, sugar for Clara, though she took only half a spoonful. Seed cake was offered, thin slices of buttered bread, and a dish of homemade blackberry jelly that Clara had made the week before. A conversation began in the easiest way. News of the village, the new vicar at St. Mary Mead, who preached rather long sermons. The astonishing price of coal this winter. Then, naturally, it turned to the forthcoming wedding. Thomas Hale was expected later that afternoon. He had business in Much Benham that morning, but had promised to join them for tea. Clara spoke of him with quiet fondness, how thoughtful he was, how he always remembered to bring her favorite ginger biscuits when he called, how he read aloud from Trollope in the evenings when the light began to fall. He makes everything feel steady, Clara said, choosing her words carefully. After so many years alone, that steadiness is a great comfort. Mrs. Grayson nodded approvingly, though her glance toward Miss Marple carried a trace of the same unease that had prompted the letter. Yet Miss Marple listened, nodding from time to time, asking small, gentle questions. She noticed how Clara's hands moved, folding and refolding the edge of her napkin when the conversation touched on the future, smoothing it flat again when it turned to the past. She noticed, too, the way Clara's gaze sometimes drifted towards the mantelpiece, where a small silver-frame photograph stood, turned slightly sideways, its back to the room. When Clara rose to fetch more hot water, Miss Marple's eyes followed her. The photograph was of a young man in uniform, Second World War, by the cut of the tunic and the shape of the cap. He was smiling broadly, the sort of smile that suggests confidence in tomorrow. The frame was old, the glass slightly clouded with age. Clara returned with the kettle, refilled the teapot, and sat down again. Yet as she reached to adjust a curtain that had caught the light, her sleeve brushed the photograph. It tilted, and for a brief moment, its face was visible to the room. Clara paused, then with a small, almost automatic gesture, turned it face down on the mantel, as though to protect it from dust. "I'm so sorry," she murmured, a faint flush rising to her cheeks. "It collects dust so quickly. I must remember to wipe it more often." Mrs. Grayson said nothing, only sipped her tea. Miss Marple said nothing either, but she noted the gesture, the quickness of it, the slight tremble in Clara's fingers as they returned to her lap. It was a small thing, trifling even, yet in the quiet order of that pleasant room, it felt distinctly out of place. A photograph turned face down is not the same as one put away in a drawer or covered with a cloth against sunlight. It is a deliberate act of partial hiding, as though the viewer wishes neither to look at it fully nor to banish it altogether. The afternoon wore on. Thomas Hale arrived just after 4, a tall, spare man with graying hair and kind, rather tired eyes behind horn-rimmed spectacles. He carried a small paper bag containing macaroons from the bakery in Much Benham. Clara's favorite, he explained with a shy smile, and greeted Miss Marple with old-fashioned courtesy. They talked easily, of books, of the garden, of the changes in the district since the war. Thomas spoke of his work as a solicitor, mostly wills and small conveyances these days, no, nothing dramatic, and of how glad he was to have returned to this part of the country after so many years in London. Clara listened with a soft, attentive expression, occasionally touching his sleeve or offering him another slice of cake. Yet Miss Marple, watching quietly from her chair, could not quite dismiss the small anomaly on the mantelpiece. The face-down photograph, the careful way Clara had turned it, the faint apology in her voice. These were not dramatic clues, not the sort that belong in sensational tales. They were the kind of details that accumulate in ordinary lives, small stones in a quiet stream, unnoticed, until one day the water runs a little differently around them. As the light began to fade and the first lamps were lit, Miss Marple rose to take her leave. Clara walked her to the gate, the air now carrying the cool promise of evening. "Thank you for coming," Clara said softly. "It means a great deal to Aunt Eleanor, and to me." Miss Marple patted her hand. "I shall come again soon, if I may. There is always more to talk about when one has begun." Clara smiled, but the smile did not quite reach her eyes. Miss Marple walked home slowly along the same footpath, the last blackberries now dark against the hedge. She thought of the photograph, of the careful turning, of the way Clara spoke of steadiness, as though it were something newly discovered rather than long awaited. Nothing urgent presented itself, only a small persistent sense that something in the picture on the mantelpiece did not quite match the picture being presented in the sitting room. And sometimes, so Miss Marple reflected as the first stars appeared above the quiet fields, that is exactly where the thread of a story begins to unravel. Not with a loud tear, but with the gentlest loosening of a single stitch. Chapter 3. Gentle Observations. The days that followed passed in the unhurried way that village timers always preferred. Miss Marple accepted Mrs. Grayson's gentle invitation to stay a little longer, just until the weekend, if it pleases you. And so she settled into the small spare room at Rose Cottage, with its sloping ceiling, whitewashed walls, and a window that looked out over the back garden. The bed was narrow but comfortable, the sheets smelling faintly of lavender from the sachets tucked between them. And each morning a small jug of hot water appeared on the washstand, as though by magic, as she moved through the household quietly, like a shadow that disturbs nothing. She helped where help was welcome, shelling peas with Clara in the kitchen, deadheading the dahlias with Mrs. Grayson in the afternoon sun, folding napkins into neat triangles before supper. But mostly she watched, not with scrutiny, but with the calm, patient attention one gives to a familiar garden, noticing how the light falls differently on the same plants from one day to the next. Clara was always kind, always composed. She rose early to light the kitchen range, prepared breakfast with careful movements, porridge for her aunt, boiled eggs and toast for Miss Marple, weak tea for them both, and spoke pleasantly of small things. The new recipe for damson jam she meant to try, the way the cat had taken to sleeping on the warm flags by the back door. Yet there were pauses in her speech, brief silences when her hands stilled over whatever task she was doing, as though she had suddenly remembered something she had long trained herself to forget. Miss Marple noted these pauses the way one notes the exact moment a cloud covers the sun. They were not dramatic. Clara never sighed heavily or stared into the distance with theatrical melancholy. She simply stopped for a second or two, then resumed with the same gentle smile. Once, while slicing bread, she paused with the knife halfway through the loaf, her eyes on nothing in particular. When she noticed Miss Marple watching, she laughed softly and said, "I was wondering whether we have enough butter for tomorrow's scones." Thomas Hale, called most afternoons, is sometimes bringing a small offering, a bunch of late sweet peas from his landlady's garden, a copy of the local paper folded open to the crossword he knew Clara enjoyed, or simply himself with his quiet, courteous manner. He never stayed too long. He seemed to understand that the three women had their own rhythm and did not wish to disturb it. Yet when he was there, Clara's manner changed in the smallest, most subtle ways. She sat a little straighter. Her hands rested more calmly in her lap. And when he spoke, she listened with a kind of attentive stillness that suggested relief. One evening, after Thomas had left, the three women sat by the fire with their knitting and a pot of chamomile tea. Mrs. Grayson mentioned in passing that old Mrs. that Pettigrew down the lane had once been quite the catch in her day, before a broken engagement sent her into a long, quiet retirement. She never married after that, Mrs. Grayson said, shaking her head. Some hearts don't quite recover, do they? Clara's needles clicked on for a moment, then stopped. She looked up, her expression mild. Poor Mrs. Pettigrew. I think she's quite content now, with her books and her cat. The subject changed smoothly to the pattern of the shawl Clara was making, but Miss Marple had seen the brief tightening of Clara's mouth, the way her gaze flicked once toward the mantelpiece where the silver-framed photograph still stood, now turned face forward again, though at an angle that kept the young soldier's smile partly in shadow. Another afternoon, while Thomas was away in much Benham on business, Clara took Miss Marple into the back garden. It was a sheltered space, walled on three sides by old brick, warmed by the sun, with a narrow lawn, rose beds, and a small herb patch near the kitchen door. Clara walked slowly along the paths, pointing out this plant and that, the rosemary that had survived 3 hard winters, the lavender that drew bees even in September. At the far end, near the wall where ivy had begun to climb again, stood a single rose bush, different from the others. Its stems were thicker, its leaves a darker green, and though the season was late, it still carried 3 or 4 blooms of a deep, velvety crimson, almost black at the edges, the color of old port wine left too long in the bottle. My mother planted it, Clara said, stopping in front of the bush. She reached out and touched one petal lightly with the tip of her finger, then drew her hand back, as though the flower had reminded her of something sharp. It was a gift, years ago, from someone who knew how much she loved old roses. Miss Marple stood beside her, hands folded at her waist. A lovely color, not one you see often. No, Clara agreed. It's called Eternal Flame, or something close to that. The name has faded from the label, but the scent is still the same, sweet with just a hint of spice. She paused again, that small, familiar silence. I've kept it going all these years. Cuttings, new plants, when the old one weakens. It seems a shame to let it go. Miss Marple nodded. Some things are worth the trouble. Clara smiled, but it was the smile of someone remembering, rather than looking forward. Yes, some things are. They walked back toward the house in companionable quiet. Miss Marple noticed how Clara's steps slowed as they passed the kitchen window, how she glanced once toward the sitting room where the photograph waited on the mantel. Inside, Mrs. Grayson was dozing in her chair by the fire, the newspaper open across her lap. Clara moved softly to adjust the shawl over her aunt's knees, then stood for a moment, looking down at the sleeping face with an expression of such tenderness that Miss Marple felt she was seeing something private. Later that evening, when the lamps were lit and the curtains drawn against the early dark, Clara read aloud from a novel they had all been enjoying, a gentle story of village life and quiet affections. Her voice was low and clear, never hurried. Aunt Thomas had sent a note saying he would be late that day, so it was just the 3 women. The fire crackling softly, the clock ticking its steady measure. Miss Marple listened, but her mind wandered gently over the small observations she had gathered. The pauses, the careful smiles, the rosebush, tended like a memorial. The photograph that was sometimes turned away and sometimes allowed to face the room, but never quite fully. None of it pointed to anything alarming. There was no hint of unhappiness in Clara's daily life, only a faint, persistent reserve, as though part of her heart had learned long ago to stay just out of reach. And yet, Miss Marple thought, as she prepared for bed that night, watching the moon rise pale and small above the garden wall. People do not keep photographs turned at careful angles, tend single rose bushes with such devotion, unless those things carry a weight beyond the ordinary. The weight was not heavy enough to disturb the surface calm of Rose Cottage, but it was there, quiet and steady, like the low hum of a distant river that one only notices when everything else falls silent. She slipped between the lavender-scented sheets, turned out the lamp, and let the darkness settle. Tomorrow, she decided, she would ask one or two small, ordinary questions. Nothing pressing, nothing that would startle. Just enough to see whether the thread she had begun to feel beneath her fingers would draw a little tighter or simply slip away again into the soft fabric of village life. Chapter 4. A Calm Contradiction. The weekend arrived with a gentle shift in the weather. The sky remained clear, but a cooler breeze moved through the garden, rustling the last of the dahlia petals and carrying the faint, clean scent of approaching rain. Miss Marple found herself content to stay on at Rose Cottage a little longer. Mrs. Grayson had insisted, saying the house felt brighter with company, and Clara had added quietly that she enjoyed having someone to share the small daily tasks with. So the days continued in their soft, measured way. Breakfast by the kitchen window, short walks along the lane when the sun was high, afternoons spent knitting or reading beside the fire. Thomas Hale's visits had become part of the rhythm. He arrived most days shortly after luncheon, often with a small parcel or a newspaper, and stayed until the light began to fade. He never imposed. He seemed to sense exactly how much presence the household could comfortably hold. On Saturday evening, the four of them gathered in the sitting room after a simple supper of cold chicken, salad from the garden, and Mrs. Grayson's apple charlotte. The fire burned low and steady, casting a warm amber glow across the room. Lamps had been lit on the side tables, their shades softened with rose-colored silk, and the clock on the mantel ticked with the same unhurried patience it had kept for decades. Clara had suggested a game of cards, something light, an old favorite called Patience, but Thomas proposed reading aloud instead. He had brought with him a slim volume of short stories by a writer they all knew, and Clara agreed at once, saying it would be pleasant to listen rather than strain her eyes in the lamplight. So she settled into the armchair nearest the fire, a shawl across her knees. Mrs. Grayson took the sofa, her knitting in her lap. Miss Marple chose the low chair by the window, where she could see both the room and the darkening garden beyond the glass. Thomas read in a calm, even voice, pausing now and then to let a sentence settle or to turn a page with care. The story he chose was gentle, a tale of two old friends meeting again after many years, discovering how much had changed and how much had remained the same. When he reached the end, there was a small, satisfied silence. No one spoke for a moment. The fire crackled softly, and somewhere outside, an owl called once, low and distant. Mrs. Grayson broke the quiet first. "That was lovely, Thomas. You read so well, almost as though you've lived the words yourself." Thomas smiled, on a little shyly. "I've always liked stories that feel true. They remind one how ordinary lives can hold their own kind of drama. Clara looked across at him, her expression fond. You make everything sound so peaceful. He set the book aside on the small table beside him. Most things are, once the dust settles. I remember the first time I saw you properly, Clara, at the summer fete in St. Mary Mead, 20 years ago, this coming June. You were standing near the tea tent, wearing that pale green dress with the little flowers on it. Someone asked you to dance, and you did. One dance only. Then you went back to helping with the cakes. Clara gave a soft laugh, surprised. You remember all that? Every detail, Thomas said simply. You were promised to another then, of course. I understood. I never forgot the way you smiled when you thanked me for the dance, though. It was kind, even though your mind was clearly elsewhere. The room remained quiet, but something in the air had shifted, very slightly, like the moment before a door is opened in a still house. Clara's hands, which had been resting calmly in her lap, tightened once around the edge of her shawl, then relaxed again. She looked down at the fire for a second before lifting her eyes to Thomas. I don't think I ever thanked you properly for being so understanding back then, she said. It was a difficult summer. Thomas nodded. I know. And I never wish to add to it. Miss Marple, who had been listening without speaking, now asked in her mildest voice, was that the fete where the band played so late into the evening? I remember the lanterns in the trees. Yes, Thomas answered. They looked like fireflies. Clara danced with me just as the music changed to something slower. Clara smiled again, but the smile carried a faint shadow. It was only one dance. I didn't stay long after that. Mrs. Grayson glanced between them, then at Miss Marple. She said nothing, but her knitting needles had paused. Later, when Thomas had taken his leave, promising to call again the next afternoon, and the women were alone, Clara busied herself, clearing the small plates and glasses. Miss Marple helped, carrying the tray to the kitchen, where the range still gave off a gentle warmth. Mrs. Grayson remained by the fire, drowsing a little. In the quiet of the kitchen, with only the soft clink of china, Clara spoke almost to herself. I was engaged then, you know, and to Edward Langley. He had just been called up again. His regiment was being sent overseas. We thought it would be short. We planned to marry when he came back on leave. Miss Marple set the tray down carefully. I remember hearing of him. A kind young man, everyone said. He was. Clara rinsed a cup under the tap, watching the water swirl. Letters came for a while. Then they stopped. No explanation, no telegram, just silence. We waited months. In the end, the War Office said he was missing, presumed killed. I waited longer than that, though. Years, really. Until it felt dishonest to keep waiting. She dried her hands on a cloth, folded it neatly, and placed it on the rail. When Thomas came back to the district a few years ago, widowed himself, I was glad of his friendship. He never pressed. He simply stayed. And when he asked me to marry him last spring, it felt like the sensible thing, the right thing. Miss Marple nodded slowly. It sounds as though you have both been patient. Clara looked at her then, directly. I was the one left behind, Miss Marple. The one who had to accept that promises sometimes end without anyone meaning them to. If anyone was spurned, it was me. The words hung in the warm kitchen air. Miss Marple said nothing in reply, only reached for another cup to dry. But as she did so, she remembered Thomas's gentle recounting of the dance, the way he had spoken of Clara being promised to another. as though she had made a choice that excluded him. Yet Clara's account was different, not of choosing, but of being chosen by circumstance, of waiting for someone who never returned. It was not a loud contradiction. No voices had been raised, no accusations made. It was only a small misalignment, the sort that might pass unnoticed in a hurried conversation. But in the stillness of Rose Cottage, where every word was weighed and every silence respected, it stood out clearly. Thomas remembered a moment when Clara had seemed to turn away from possibility. Clara remembered only the long, empty space left by someone else's absence. Miss Marple carried the last of the cups back to the dresser. "These things take time to settle properly," she said quietly. "Even the simplest truths sometimes need a little light shone on them from a different angle." Clara nodded, though her expression remained thoughtful. They returned to the sitting room, where Mrs. Grayson had dozed off completely. The shawl slipped to one side. Clara adjusted it with care, and then sat down again, staring into the dying fire. Miss Marple took her own chair and picked up her knitting. The needles moved slowly, steadily. She did not press for more that evening. Some contradictions, she knew, needed time to reveal whether they were true inconsistencies or merely the shadows cast by memory itself. Outside, the first soft drops of rain began to fall against the window panes. Gentle, unhurried, the kind of rain that soothes rather than disturbs. Inside, the house settled into its nighttime quiet, holding its small secrets close, waiting for morning. Chapter 5. A Detail Revisited. Sunday morning arrived wrapped in a soft grey mist that clung to the fields and softened the outlines of the cottages along the lane. The rain of the previous night had passed quietly in the small hours, leaving the garden at Rose Cottage glistening, every leaf tipped with a single clear drop. Miss Marple woke early to the sound of water dripping steadily from the thatch onto the stone flags below her window. She lay for a few minutes, listening to the rhythm, slow even, almost meditative, before rising, folding back the blankets, and dressing in her usual quiet way. Downstairs, Clara was already in the kitchen, moving about with the same gentle efficiency. The range glowed warmly, the kettle sang on the hob. Mrs. Grayson had not yet come down, so the house held that special hush of early morning when only one person is awake and the day has not yet fully begun. Miss Marple joined Clara at the table. They shared toast and marmalade in companionable silence for a while. The only sounds the scrape of a knife, the soft clink of china, and the occasional drip from the eaves outside. When the plates were cleared, Clara poured fresh tea and sat down again, folding her hands around her cup as though drawing warmth from it. Miss Marple spoke first, her voice as mild as the mist beyond the window. "Clara dear, I wonder if I might see that photograph on the mantel again, the one in the silver frame. I caught only a glimpse the other day, and I should like to look at it properly, if you don't mind." Clara hesitated. Her fingers tightened briefly around the cup, then relaxed. She rose without a word, crossed to the sitting room, and returned a moment later with the small frame in her hands. She placed it on the table between them, face up, the glass catching the pale morning light. The young man in the photograph wore the uniform of an infantry officer, Second World War, late in the conflict by the style of the cap and the single ribbon bar. He was handsome in an unassuming way, clear eyes, a broad, open smile, hair cut short, but not severely. The background was plain, a studio backdrop of draped curtains, but the smile suggested confidence, perhaps even eagerness. On the reverse, written in faded blue ink that had once been bold, were the words, "To Clara, with all my heart, Edward, 1945. Miss Marple turned the frame carefully in her hands, studying first the front, then the back. She did not hurry. Clara watched her, saying nothing. After a long moment, Miss Marple set the photograph down gently. A fine-looking young man. And the date? 1945. That would have been just before the end, wouldn't it? Yes, Clara answered quietly. He was sent back out after a short leave. We thought it would be the last push. We were wrong about how long it would take, but not about the hope. Miss Marple nodded. She glanced toward the garden door, where the mist still hung thick, and the rose bush, the one called Eternal Flame, or near enough. You said your mother planted it. Clara's gaze followed hers. Edward brought the cuttings from his family's garden the summer before he left for good. He said they were special, old French stock, hardy enough for our soil. He promised we'd plant a whole bed of them together when he came home. When the letters stopped and the waiting turned into certainty, I planted what he'd left anyway. One bush at first, then cuttings when it grew strong. It's the only one left now. Miss Marple listened without interrupting. The kitchen clock ticked on, marking seconds that felt slower than usual. Thomas knows about Edward. Of course, Clara continued. I told him early on. He never minded. He said everyone carries their past, and that the future is large enough for two people to bring theirs along. Miss Marple reached for her tea, took a small sip, then set the cup down again. Thomas mentioned the fete, the one 20 years ago, when you danced once. He said you were promised to another then. Clara looked puzzled for a moment, then understanding came. He did say that, didn't he? Yes. I suppose I was. In a way. Miss Marple waited. Clara drew a slow breath. Edward was reported missing in the autumn of 1945. No body was ever found, but the War Office eventually listed him as presumed killed in action. I waited longer than most would have. I didn't go out much. I didn't accept invitations. The fete Thomas remembers. I went only because Aunt Eleanor insisted. I helped with the tea tent, and when someone asked me to dance, I said yes because it seemed rude to refuse. It was one dance, nothing more. I left soon after. Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. And yet, Thomas spoke as though you had chosen someone else over him. As though the promise was still active, still a barrier. Clara frowned faintly. I never thought of it that way. To me, Edward was gone. There was no choice left to make. The contradiction lay there between them now, small but clear, like a single dropped stitch in an otherwise perfect piece of knitting. Miss Marple did not press it further. Instead, she asked very gently, May I see the rose bush again? In this light, perhaps it will look different. Clara rose at once, and they stepped out into the garden together. The mist had begun to lift, revealing the wet grass and the dark earth between the plants. The rose bush stood as before, sturdy, a little overgrown, its remaining blooms heavy with dew. Miss Marple bent to examine one flower closely. The petals were velvet deep, almost black at the edges where the color concentrated. The scent rose softly, sweet, with that faint, spicy undertone Clara had mentioned. Edward must have loved roses very much, Miss Marple said. He did. His mother kept a famous garden. He used to send me pressed flowers in his letters, small things, but they always arrived smelling of summer. Miss Marple straightened. She looked back toward the house, where the silver-framed photograph now sat on the kitchen table, waiting. You and Thomas, does he ever mention roses? Clara thought for a moment. Not really. He brings sweet peas sometimes, or chrysanthemums from the market, but never roses. They returned indoors. The photograph remained on the table. Miss Marple did not touch it again, but the details she had revisited, the date on the back, the promise of planting together, the single dance at the fete, began to settle into a new pattern in her mind. The young man in the photograph had vanished in 1945. Clara had waited, mourned, and eventually accepted the silence as final. Yet Thomas remembered a moment 20 years later, around 1965, when Clara was still promised to another. If Edward had been gone for 2 decades by then, the promise could only have lived on in Clara's heart, or in the way others still saw her, a woman who had never quite let go. But Thomas's words had carried a different shade, not of sympathy for a long grief, but of a gentle, lingering regret, as though he had once stood just outside a closed door. Miss Marple sat down again, her hands folded in her lap. She looked at Clara with the same calm kindness she had shown from the beginning. I think, she said quietly, that some promises are not broken by choice. They are simply left hanging when one person disappears and the other is left holding the thread. And sometimes, years later, another person comes along who has been holding a different thread all along, one that was never offered, but never quite put down either. Clara looked at her, eyes widening slowly as the small accumulated details began to shift and realign. Miss Marple did not explain further. Not yet. There was no hurry. The morning light had strengthened now, spilling across the table and catching the silver frame in a soft gleam. Outside, the last of the mist dissolved, leaving the garden clear and bright. The detail had been revisited. The photograph, the rose, the dance, the date. They no longer sat in their original places. They had moved just enough to let a little more light fall on what had always been there, waiting quietly to be seen. Chapter 6. Quiet explanation. Monday morning brought a clear sky and a light breeze that moved the last of the autumn leaves in slow drifting circles across the garden at Rose Cottage. The air felt freshly washed after the weekend rain. Every surface, the brick path, the wooden gate, the stone windowsills, gleamed with a soft, subdued shine. Miss Marple woke to the sound of Clara opening the back door to let the cat out, then the gentle clatter of the kettle being filled. She dressed slowly, choosing her softest cardigan, and went downstairs to find Clara already setting the breakfast table with the same quiet care she always showed. Mrs. Grayson joined them shortly after, moving a little more stiffly than usual, but smiling when she saw the 2 women waiting. They ate in the kitchen rather than the sitting room, porridge with a spoonful of honey, toast cut into neat triangles, tea poured from the brown earthenware pot that had belonged to Mrs. Grayson's mother. Conversation was light. The weather forecast promised another fine day. The vicar had announced a harvest supper next week, and the cat had brought in a single leaf, as though it were a prize. And when the plates were cleared and the tea refreshed, Miss Marple suggested they move to the sitting room. There is something I should like to say, she began gently, if you will both allow me a few minutes. Nothing urgent, nothing that requires haste, only a small gathering of thoughts that have been settling these past days. Clara looked at her aunt, then back at Miss Marple. She nodded once, without speaking. Mrs. Grayson set her cup down carefully on the small side table, and folded her hands in her lap. They settled into their usual places. Miss Marple in the low chair by the window, Clara on the sofa nearest the fire, Mrs. Grayson opposite her in the high-backed armchair. The photograph in its silver frame had been returned to the mantel, face forward now, the young soldier's smile catching the morning light in a calm, one-changing way. Outside, a robin landed briefly on the sill, tilted its head, then flew off again. Miss Marple began without preamble, her voice low and steady, the way one speaks when reading a familiar letter aloud. "I have been thinking about the phrase that seems to hover over this little household," she said. "The spurned lover. It appeared first in my mind when I read your letter, Helena, though you never used the words yourself, and it has stayed with me ever since. At first, I thought it referred to Clara, to the long silence after Edward disappeared, to the way she waited and then accepted that waiting had become its own kind of ending. But the more I listened and watched, the more I came to see that the spurned one was not Clara at all." She paused, letting the words rest for a moment. It was Thomas. Clara drew in a quiet breath. Mrs. Grayson's eyes widened slightly, but she remained still. "Thomas has loved you, Clara, for a very long time," Miss Marple continued gently. "Not in any dramatic or possessive way, never that, but steadily, from a distance, the way a man who knows his place might love without ever expecting to be loved in return. He saw you first, properly, at that fete 20 years ago. You were already promised to Edward. The understanding between you was known to everyone in the district. Thomas asked you to dance once. You accepted out of politeness, and then you returned to the tea tent. He never forgot it, but he also never pressed. When Edward was reported missing, Thomas did what any decent man would do. He stepped back further. He left the district for many years, work in London, later marriage to another kind woman who needed him. Yet he built a life, yet he carried that one dance, that one moment quietly inside him." Miss Marple's gaze moved to the photograph on the mantel. "Edward vanished in 1945. No word, no body, only the War Office's eventual presumption of death. You waited, Clara, longer than most would have thought reasonable. You tended the rose he had given your mother. You kept his photograph close, sometimes turned away when the sight of it became too heavy. You mourned in silence, and in time you closed that chapter, not out of hardness, but out of necessity. When Thomas returned to the district, widowed and alone, he found you still gentle, still reserved, but no longer waiting for someone who would never come back. He offered friendship first. Then, last spring, when the moment felt right, he offered more." Clara's hands lay folded in her lap. She had not moved since Miss Marple began. "The small contradiction we felt the other evening," Miss Marple went on, "came from Thomas's own words. He spoke of you as having been promised to another at the fete, as though you had chosen Edward over him in that moment. But in truth, there was no choice for you to make then, only a promise already given. Thomas remembers it as a gentle refusal because to him it felt final. He has carried that small wound, not bitterly, never bitterly, for 20 years. He never told you how deeply he felt, even after Edward was gone, because he feared it would seem he was taking advantage of your grief. He feared you would think he had waited only for the chance to step into another man's place. So he said nothing of the depth of his feeling. He simply stayed near steady and kind, right until you were ready to see him, not as a friend, but as a possible future. Miss Marple looked at Clara directly now, her eyes kind. And the passion crime of the title. There is none in the usual sense. No jealousy, no betrayal, no violence. Only the quiet crime that time sometimes commits against those who love without speaking, years spent in silence, misunderstandings left to grow like ivy over a gate that could have been opened long ago. Thomas spurned himself, in a way, by holding back what he most wished to give. You, Clara, were left to carry the weight of an unfinished promise, never quite sure whether to honor it forever or let it go. Both of you have been spurned, not by each other, but by circumstance, by absence, by the fear of saying too much or too little. The room remained quiet. The fire had burned down to a soft glow. On outside, the breeze moved the leaves again in their slow dance. Clara's eyes had filled slowly as Miss Marple spoke, not with tears that fell, but with a gentle shining that softened her face. She looked toward the photograph, then back to Miss Marple. "I never knew," she said, almost in a whisper. I thought his kindness was simply that. Kindness. I never imagined he had waited so long." Miss Marple nodded. "He is a modest man. Modesty can hide a great deal." Mrs. Grayson reached across and took Clara's hand. "He has been good to you, dear, and you to him. Perhaps now the past can rest properly, and the future can begin without shadows." Clara drew a slow breath. "Yes, perhaps." Miss Marple rose quietly. "I have said what needed saying. There is no need for hurry or grand declarations. When Thomas comes this afternoon, you will know what to do. Hearts that have waited this long usually find their own way of speaking once the silence is broken." She moved to the window and looked out at the garden. The rose bush stood dark against the brick wall, its last blooms still holding their deep color. The sun had strengthened now, warming the room, turning the silver frame on the mantel into a small, bright point of light. Everything necessary had been explained, not with drama, not with accusation, but with the calm clarity that comes when small truths are finally placed side by side. The spurned lover had not committed any crime beyond the human one of reticence. In understanding that, the last small knot in the thread had loosened. Miss Marple turned back to the room, smiling faintly. "Now," she said, "perhaps a fresh pot of tea before luncheon? The kettle will be singing again by now." Clara rose, smoothing her skirt. "Yes," she said softly. "Let's have tea." And so they did, quietly, companionably, the way people do when a long-carried weight has at last been set down. Chapter 7. Peaceful Resolution. The afternoon sun slanted low across the garden at Rose Cottage, turning the wet grass to pale gold and catching the last crimson petals of the rose bush in a quiet glow. Thomas Hale arrived a little earlier than usual, carrying a small paper bag from the village bakery, ginger biscuits, still warm, and a modest bunch of white chrysanthemums tied with twine. He knocked softly at the front door, the sound almost lost in the rustle of leaves overhead. Clara opened the door herself. She had changed into a simple grey dress with a soft collar, her hair neatly pinned, and though her expression was calm, there was a new stillness in her eyes. Something settled, something released. She greeted him with her usual warmth, but when he stepped inside, she did not immediately lead him to the sitting room. Instead, she paused in the narrow hallway, the light from the open door falling across her face. "Thomas," she said quietly, "before we join Aunt Eleanor and Miss Marple, there is something I should like to say. He stopped, the paper bag still in his hand, his kind eyes searching hers. Of course. Clara drew a slow breath. Miss Marple has explained everything, not with any great drama, but with the clarity she always has. She told me how long you waited, how you carried that one dance from the fete all these years, how you never spoke of what it meant to you because you feared it would seem like taking advantage of my grief. I never knew. Thomas looked down for a moment, the faint color rising along his neck. When he spoke, his voice was low, almost careful. I never wanted you to feel pressed, Clara. Not then, not later. You had lost someone, someone you loved deeply. I thought if I said anything, it would only add to the weight you were already carrying. So I waited. And when the years passed, and you seemed ready to open the door again, I was content simply to stand near it. Clara reached out and touched his sleeve lightly. You stood near it for 20 years. He gave a small, rueful smile. It never felt like waiting. It felt like honoring what was. They stood there a moment longer, on the hallway quiet, except for the distant tick of the grandfather clock in the sitting room. Then Clara said, very softly, I was never spurned by you, Thomas. And you were never spurned by me, not truly. We were both left standing by someone else's absence, but we are here now. And I should like us to step through that door together, without any more shadows between us. Thomas looked at her then, really looked, as though seeing her for the first time, without the veil of old caution. His eyes filled slowly, not with tears that fell, but with a gentle brightness. He set the paper bag and the flowers down on the small hall table, took both her hands in his, and said simply, I have loved you quietly for a very long time, Clara. If you will have me, I should like to love you openly now. Clara smiled, the first smile Miss Marple had seen that reached fully into her eyes, free of the faint distance that had lingered for so many years. I will, she answered, and I shall love you in return, as steadily as you have loved me. They remained like that for a little while, hands clasped, the sunlight warming the tiles beneath their feet. No grand declarations followed, no hurried embraces, only the quiet certainty of two people who had waited long enough to know what they wanted, and who now found it standing right in front of them. When they finally entered the sitting room, Mrs. Grayson looked up from her knitting with a small, knowing smile. Miss Marple sat by the window, her own needles idle in her lap, watching the garden with the same patient attention she had given everything else these past days. Clara spoke first, her voice clear and calm. Aunt Eleanor, Miss Marple, Thomas and I have talked. Everything is understood now. We shall go forward together, quietly, as we always have, but without the old silences. Mrs. Grayson set her knitting aside and rose slowly to embrace her niece, then Thomas. I am glad, my dears. Very glad. Miss Marple remained seated, but her smile was warm and satisfied. Sometimes the simplest truths take the longest to find their way into words, she said. But once they do, the rest follows naturally. Thomas turned to her. Thank you, Miss Marple, for seeing what neither of us quite could. She inclined her head. I only listened, my dear. The rest was already there, waiting to be noticed. They sat together then, 4 people in a room, warmed by firelight and late afternoon sun, sharing tea and ginger biscuits, speaking of small, ordinary plans. The wedding in the spring, a quiet service at the village church, tea afterwards in the garden if the weather held. No haste, no elaborate arrangements, only the gentle business of two lives finally aligning after years of parallel paths. As evening drew near, Miss Marple prepared to leave. She had stayed longer than she had intended, but the days had passed in such peaceful rhythm that she felt no regret. Clara walked her to the gate, the air now cool and scented with damp earth and fading roses. "You will come back for the wedding?" Clara asked. "Of course," Miss Marple replied. "I should not miss it for anything." Clara hesitated, then said, "To thank you for everything, for seeing the small things and for saying them gently." Miss Marple patted her hand. "Small things are often the truest ones, my dear. They are the ones that last." She walked back along the footpath to St. Mary Mead as the first stars appeared, pale and steady above the quiet fields. The blackberry hedge still held a few late fruits. She picked one absently, tasting the last sweetness of the season. Behind her, Rose Cottage glowed with lamplight, its windows soft yellow squares against the deepening dusk. Inside that house, order had been restored, not through dramatic revelation or confrontation, but through the simple act of speaking what had long been felt in silence. The spurned lover had not committed any crime of passion. He had only loved with patience, and in time, that patience had been met with equal gentleness. The title, once a quiet puzzle, now made perfect sense. A story of love deferred by absence, not by rejection, and finally claimed in the calm light of understanding. Miss Marple reached her own cottage just as the church clock struck 7. She let herself in, lit the lamp in the sitting room, and sat for a moment in her usual chair, listening to the familiar sounds of home settling around her. The tick of the clock, the faint creak of the floorboards cooling, the distant hoot of an owl beyond the garden wall. She felt no need to hurry to bed. Instead, she took up her knitting once more, the cream wool soft between her fingers, and worked a few steady rows. The bed socks for Mrs. Bantry were nearly finished. Tomorrow she would complete them, or perhaps add a small ribbon at the cuff for prettiness. Outside, the night deepened peacefully. In Lower Loxley, Clara and Thomas would be sitting by the fire with Mrs. Grayson, talking quietly of tomorrow and the days after. No shadows lingered now. The past had been honored, the future quietly welcomed. And so the small mystery, like so many in village life, had come to its gentle close, not with fanfare, but with the satisfying click of a latch falling into place. Miss Marple set her knitting aside at last, turned out the lamp, and climbed the stairs to bed. The moon rose high and silver over St. Mary Mead, bathing the lanes and gardens in its calm light. Sleep well now, dear listener. Let the day's small cares drift away like leaves on a quiet stream. May your own heart rest as peacefully as a village under starlight. May every gentle question answered, every quiet longing met at last. Good night. Chapter 8. A Gentle Epilogue. Several months passed, as months do in villages like St. Mary Mead and Lower Loxley, quietly, without fanfare, yet each one leaving its small, indelible mark on the landscape and the lives within it. Winter came softly that year, first with mists that hung in the valleys like pale silk, then with frosts that turned the grass silver under the morning sun, and finally with a light snowfall just before Christmas that dusted the rooftops and hedgerows without ever becoming a burden. Rose Cottage bore the season well. Smoke rose steadily from its chimney. The windows glowed with lamplight in the early afternoons. Inside, the sitting room had changed in small, comforting ways. The silver-framed photograph of Edward Langley still stood on the mantel, but now it shared the space with a newer, smaller frame. A snapshot taken the previous autumn of Clara and Thomas standing together beneath the chestnut tree on the green, both smiling, both looking directly at the camera, as though they had finally decided the moment was worth keeping forever. The rose bush in the garden had been carefully pruned back in late autumn. Clara had taken cuttings once more, rooting them in small pots on the kitchen windowsill, where they caught the weak winter sun. She no longer touched the petals with quite the same careful distance. The gesture had softened into something closer to affection than memorial. The bush remained a link to the past, but it no longer carried the whole weight of it. The wedding had taken place in early April, on a day when the sky was the pale washed blue of spring, and the churchyard daffodils stood straight and golden along the path. It was exactly as they had planned. Small, simple, attended by family, a handful of close neighbors, and Miss Marple, who had walked over from St. Mary Mead, wearing her best grey coat and a sprig of lily of the valley pinned to her lapel. The service had been short and sincere. The vicar spoke of love that endures through seasons of waiting, of patience as a quiet form of courage. Clara wore a dress of soft dove-grey silk, nothing elaborate, with a small corsage of white violets. Thomas stood beside her in a dark suit, his hand steady as he placed the plain gold band on her finger. When they turned to face the small congregation, Clara's smile was calm and complete. No shadows, no lingering distance. On afterwards, there had been tea in the garden at Rose Cottage. The sun had warmed the brick walls enough to make the air feel gentle. Tables had been set beneath the chestnut tree with white cloths, sandwiches cut into neat triangles, Mrs. Grayson's seed cake, and a bowl of early strawberries someone had brought from the greenhouse at the hall. Laughter had moved quietly among the guests, the kind that comes easily when people are glad without needing to explain why. Miss Marple had stayed until the last of the light began to fade. Before leaving, she had taken Clara's hand for a moment and said very softly, "You both look as though you have come home." Clara had squeezed her fingers in reply. "We have." Now, on this winter afternoon, several months later, the house was quiet again. Mrs. Grayson had gone to spend a few weeks with a cousin in Much Benham. Her rheumatism preferred warmer rooms during the coldest months, and Clara and Thomas had the cottage to themselves. They had not moved far. Thomas had simply brought his few possessions across the lane from his lodgings and settled them into the rooms that had always felt a little too large for one person. That afternoon, they sat together in the sitting room. A low fire burned. The kettle hummed on the hob in the kitchen. Thomas was reading the newspaper aloud, small items of local news, the price of coal, a notice about the next meeting of the Women's Institute, while Clara knitted a pair of mittens in dark green wool. The cat slept on the hearthrug, paws tucked under, purring in slow, contented rhythm. Outside, snow began to fall again, large, lazy flakes that drifted rather than drove. Clara glanced toward the window and smiled. "Look," she said, "it's starting properly now." Thomas set the paper aside and joined her at the window. They stood side by side, watching the garden turn white. The rosebush first, its pruned stems catching small caps of snow. Then the low wall, the path, the bare branches of the apple tree at the far end. The world beyond the garden fence blurred gently into softness. "Do you remember?" Clara said after a moment. How I used to worry that happiness would feel like disloyalty. Thomas nodded. I remember. I don't worry about that anymore. She leaned her head lightly against his shoulder. It feels like permission, as though Edward would have wanted this, wanted me to stop waiting in the doorway and step inside. Thomas put his arm around her waist. He would have. He was a generous man, and generous men don't begrudge happiness to the people they loved. They watched the snow fall a little longer, then returned to their chairs. Clara picked up her knitting again. Thomas resumed the newspaper, though he read more slowly now, pausing to look across at her every few minutes, as though still surprised to find her there. Later, when the light had almost gone and the lamps were lit, Clara set her work aside and went to the mantel. She took down the photograph of Edward, held it for a moment, then carried it to the small writing desk in the corner. She opened a drawer, took out a soft cloth, and wiped the glass carefully. Not to hide it, but to care for it. Then she placed it back on the mantel, turned so that the young soldier's smile caught the lamplight fully, and Thomas watched without speaking. When she returned to her chair, he said quietly, "It belongs there." "Yes," Clara answered. "It always did, just as you belong here." They sat in silence for a while, the only sounds the crackle of the fire, the soft purr of the cat, and the faint hush of snow against the window panes. Across the fields, in St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple was sitting in her own sitting room, the fire banked low, a cup of tea cooling on the table beside her. She had finished the bed socks for Mrs. Bantry weeks ago and was now knitting a small shawl in pale blue wool, something for Clara, perhaps, to wear on cool spring evenings. The room was warm, the curtains drawn, the house quiet, except for the clock, ticking its familiar measure. She thought, from time to time, of Rose Cottage, of the small mysteries that had gathered there and then gently dispersed, like mist under sunlight. Nothing had been forced, nothing had been dramatic, only a patience, observation, and the willingness to speak when the moment felt right. She smiled to herself, a small, satisfied smile, and continued knitting. The wool slipped smoothly through her fingers. The stitches formed row by row, steady and sure. Outside, the snow continued to fall across two villages, blanketing lanes and gardens alike. Somewhere, a church bell rang the hour, soft, muffled by the white quiet. Lights glowed in cottage windows. Smoke rose from chimneys. People moved through their evenings with the calm certainty that tomorrow would come in its own time. In one house, two people sat together by a fire, no longer waiting, no longer carrying separate threads. In another, an old lady knitted by lamplight, content that a small corner of the world had been set right. And so the story ended, not with a flourish, but with the gentle closing of a book whose pages had been turned slowly, thoughtfully, until every line found its proper place. Sleep well now, dear listener. Let the snow fall quietly in your mind, covering the day's small worries until morning. May your dreams be as peaceful as a winter garden under starlight, every gentle question answered, every heart at rest. Chapter 9. The last light of autumn time continued its gentle march through the villages, unmarked by anything dramatic, yet quietly transformative in the small ways that matter most. Summer followed the wedding spring, and bringing long days of soft heat and the hum of bees in the lavender borders. Then came autumn again, the same season in which Miss Marple had first received Eleanor Grayson's letter more than a year earlier. Only now the air carried a different quality, not anticipation, shadowed by uncertainty, but the ripe, settled satisfaction of things having found their proper place. One late October afternoon, when the leaves on the chestnut tree had turned the color of old gold and begun to fall in slow, drifting spirals, Miss Marple received a short note delivered by the same postman who had brought the original letter so long ago. The handwriting on the envelope was Clara's, neat, unhurried, with the same slight forward slope it had always had. Inside was a single sheet of pale cream paper. Dear Miss Marple, Thomas and I are coming to St. A merry Mead tomorrow afternoon to visit old Mrs. Pettigrew, who has not been well. We wondered whether we might call on you afterwards, if it is not too much trouble. We should like to sit for a while in your garden, if the weather holds, and perhaps share a cup of tea. There is nothing urgent to discuss, only the pleasure of seeing you again. With warmest regards, Clara Hale. Miss Marple read the note twice, then folded it carefully and placed it on the small table beside her chair. She smiled, a small, private smile, and went at once to the kitchen to check her stores. Enough tea, a tin of shortbread she had baked only the day before, a jar of last year's blackberry jelly, still bright and unopened. She would make a fresh seed cake in the morning. Clara had always liked it. The next day dawned crisp and bright, the sky a high, a clear blue that made the turning leaves seem almost luminous. Miss Marple spent the morning in her garden, sweeping the fallen leaves into neat piles along the path, cutting a few late roses to bring indoors, the same deep crimson variety that grew at Rose Cottage, though hers was smaller and more delicate. She arranged them in a plain white jug on the sitting-room table, where the light would catch their petals. Shortly after 3 o'clock, she heard footsteps on the lane. Clara and Thomas appeared at the gate, arm in arm, Clara in a warm tweed coat the color of ripe chestnuts, Thomas in his familiar dark overcoat, and a soft wool scarf she had knitted for him the previous winter. They carried between them a small wicker basket covered with a checked cloth. Miss Marple met them at the door. Come in, come in. The kettle is already on. They stepped inside, bringing with them the faint scent of wood smoke and autumn air. Clara embraced her lightly. Thomas shook her hand with his usual quiet courtesy. They moved through to the sitting room, where the fire burned low and steady, and the roses stood in their jug like small flames against the pale walls. Once settled, Clara on the sofa, Thomas in the chair opposite, Miss Marple in her own accustomed place. They spoke first of ordinary things, Mrs. Pettigrew's improving health, the new curate at the church who preached rather too enthusiastically, the astonishing number of blackberries still to be found along the footpath between the villages. Then Clara opened the basket and lifted out a small round fruit cake wrapped in greaseproof paper. I made it yesterday, she said, with the last of the blackberries and a little brandy. Thomas helped, mostly by keeping the cat out of the kitchen. Thomas smiled. I'm an excellent assistant in such matters. Miss Marple cut thin slices for each of them, spread with butter, and poured tea from the brown pot. They ate slowly, companionably. The only sounds the crackle of the fire, the tick of the clock, and the occasional murmur of pleasure at the cake. After a time, Clara set her plate aside and looked around the room as though seeing it anew. Your house always feels the same, Miss Marple, peaceful, as though time moves more gently here. It does, Miss Marple answered. Or perhaps we only notice it more clearly in a place where nothing hurries. Clara nodded. She reached into her coat pocket and drew out a small envelope, thicker than a letter, and sealed with a dab of red wax. "We wanted to bring you something," she said. "Not as thanks. There are no thanks large enough for what you gave us, but as a small remembrance." Miss Marple accepted the envelope and opened it carefully. Inside lay 3 pressed rose petals, dark crimson, perfectly preserved between 2 sheets of tissue paper. Beneath them was a single photograph, Clara and Thomas, standing in their garden the previous summer, the rose bush in full bloom behind them, both smiling with the quiet certainty of people who have found what they had long sought. "I took cuttings from the bush last spring," Clara explained. "They rooted well. We planted 3 new ones along the back wall. These petals are from the first bloom of the oldest plant, the one Edward gave my mother. I thought you might like to keep them on a little piece of the story that ended so happily." Miss Marple studied the petals, then the photograph. She touched the image lightly with one finger, as though to confirm its reality. "They are beautiful," she said, "and they will have a place here, where I can see them every day." Thomas spoke then, his voice low but clear. "You saw what neither of us could, Miss Marple. Not just the facts, the photograph, the rose, the words we spoke, but the feeling beneath them, the long patience, the fear of speaking too soon or too late. You gave us the courage to say what had waited years to be said." Miss Marple shook her head gently. "I only listened, my dear. And sometimes listening is enough to let the truth find its own way out." They sat for a while longer, watching the light change as the sun moved lower. And the garden outside took on the soft amber of late afternoon. Leaves drifted past the window in slow descent. When it was time for them to leave, Clara rose first and helped Miss Marple to her feet. "We shall come again," she said. "Often, if you will have us." "You are always welcome," Miss Marple replied. "The kettle is never far from the boil." They walked together to the gate. Thomas carried the empty basket. Clara linked her arm through Miss Marple's for the short distance down the path. At the gate they paused. The lane stretched quiet and golden before them, leaves whispering underfoot. Clara turned and embraced Miss Marple once more. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything." Miss Marple patted her back. "Go home now, both of you. The light is fading, and there is supper to think of." They walked away arm in arm, and their figures growing smaller against the autumn glow, until they turned the bend and were lost to sight. Miss Marple remained at the gate a little longer, watching the lane empty. Then she turned back to the house, carrying the small envelope with its petals and photograph. Inside, she placed them carefully on the mantelpiece beside her own small collection of treasures. A china shepherdess, a framed postcard from a long-ago holiday, a sprig of lavender pressed many years before. The fire had burned low. She added a log, watched the flames catch, then sat down in her chair with her knitting. The pale blue shawl was nearly finished. Only a few more rows remained. She worked steadily, the needles clicking in their familiar rhythm, the house settling around her with the soft sounds of evening. Outside, the last of the daylight slipped away, and stars began to appear, one by one, above the quiet garden. Somewhere in Lower Loxley, Clara and Thomas would be lighting their own lamps, drawing curtains, preparing supper in a kitchen warmed by shared presence. In St. Mary Mead, the village lights came on slowly, each one a small point of comfort against the dark. The story that had begun with a trembling letter and a face-down photograph had ended here, not in grand resolution, but in the gentle accumulation of ordinary happy days. The spurned lover had found his answer. The woman who had waited had learned to step forward, and the quiet observer who had seen it all sat now in her own peaceful room, knitting by firelight, content that the small mysteries of human hearts had once again come right in the end. Miss Marple finished the last row, cast off, and folded the shawl neatly in her lap. She looked toward the mantel, where the pressed petals and the photograph caught the flicker of the fire. "Sleep well," she murmured to the empty room, as though speaking to the past and the present together. Then she rose, turned out the lamp, and climbed the stairs to bed. The night outside was calm, the stars steady, the villages wrapped in the same quiet dark. And so the tale closed, not with finality, but with the soft promise that tomorrow would bring more small, ordinary joys, each one enough to carry the heart forward. Good night, dear listener. May your own autumn evenings be as gentle, your own stories as quietly complete. Chapter 10. Winter. Quiet. Winter deepened in the two villages with the slow inevitability of seasons that have no need to hurry. By mid-February, the snow had come and gone in gentle waves, never enough to isolate the lanes, but sufficient to blanket the fields in soft white silence and turn every rooftop into a gentle curve of icing sugar. The frost etched delicate patterns on window panes each morning. Breath hung in small clouds when people stepped outside. The air carried the clean, sharp scent of cold that makes every sound seem clearer and farther away. At Rose Cottage, the days had settled into a rhythm as steady and comforting as the tick of the old clock in the hall. Clara and Thomas rose together before first light, lit the range, made tea, and ate breakfast at the kitchen table while the cat wound between their legs, demanding attention. Thomas still kept his small office hours in Much Benham, 3 days a week, handling the quiet legal matters of wills, small sales, and neighborly disputes that never rose above the level of polite disagreement. Clara filled her mornings with the house and garden, preparing cuttings for spring planting, mending curtains, baking loaves of bread, whose aroma filled the rooms like a warm promise. In the afternoons, when Thomas returned, they often walked together along the footpath that linked Lower Loxley to St. Mary Mead. They carried a thermos of tea and a small packet of biscuits, stopping halfway to sit on the old wooden bench beneath the bare hawthorn hedge. From there, they could see both villages, the church spire of St. Mary Mead rising pale against the sky, the thatched roofs of Lower Loxley huddled together like sleeping animals. They spoke little on these walks, content simply to be side by side, our hands linked inside Thomas's coat pocket against the cold, watching the light change across the fields. One such afternoon, when the sky was the color of old pewter, and the first flakes of a new snowfall began to drift down, they paused longer than usual on the bench. Clara leaned her head against Thomas's shoulder, watching the snowflakes settle on the wool of his sleeve. "Do you ever think," she asked quietly, "how strange it is that we spent so many years in the same district, breathing the same air, yet never truly met until the moment was right?" Thomas considered the question, his breath making small clouds that mingled with hers. "I used to think about it often," he admitted. "In London, on quiet evenings when the city felt too large, I would remember that one dance and wonder what might have happened if I had spoken then. But now it feels as though the years were not wasted. They were preparation. We both needed time to become the people who could choose each other without shadows. Clara nodded slowly. I used to feel guilty for letting go of Edward's memory, as though happiness was a betrayal. But it isn't. It's honoring the life he didn't get to finish by living mine fully. They sat in silence a little longer, watching the snow thicken until the path ahead blurred into whiteness. Then Thomas stood, offering his hand. Come, he said. Miss Marple will be expecting us. She wrote that the shortbread is fresh and the fire is lit. They continued on, footsteps muffled now by the new layer of snow. When they reached St. Mary Mead, the village looked like a Christmas card left out too long. Quiet, serene. Every cottage window glowing with lamplight against the gathering dusk. Miss Marple's gate was already unlatched. A thin trail of smoke rose straight from her chimney into the windless air. She met them at the door, wrapped in a thick wool shawl, her cheeks pink from the warmth inside. You've brought the snow with you, she observed, smiling. Come in quickly before it settles on your shoulders. Inside the sitting room, everything was as it always had been. The low fire burning steadily, the kettle singing on the hob, the small table set with 3 cups and a plate of shortbread still warm from the oven. The pressed rose petals and the photograph Clara had given her stood on the mantel, flanked now by a tiny vase holding a single sprig of winter jasmine that Miss Marple had forced in a pot on the windowsill. And they settled into their chairs, Clara and Thomas on the sofa, Miss Marple in her usual place by the window. For a time they spoke of nothing in particular. The new lambs already appearing in the fields beyond the village, the price of wool rising again, the way the snow made everything look younger than it was. Then Clara set her cup down and said, We've been thinking about the garden. Thomas has an idea for a small greenhouse against the south wall. Nothing grand, just enough to start seedlings early and keep a few tender plants through the winter. We wondered if you might like to choose something to plant in it. A rose, perhaps, or whatever takes your fancy. Miss Marple's eyes brightened. That would be lovely. I've always wanted to try growing a Madame Alfred Carrière, the white noisette that climbs so beautifully. It has the most delicate scent. Then we shall find one, Thomas said, and when it blooms, we'll bring the first flower to you. They talked on as the light faded completely outside and the snow continued to fall in soft silence. Miss Marple brought out her latest knitting, a pair of fingerless mittens in soft grey wool, and showed them the pattern. Clara admired the stitch. Thomas asked practical questions about the yarn. The clock ticked, the fire crackled, the snow muffled the world beyond the windows. When it was time for them to leave, Miss Marple walked them to the gate despite the cold. Snowflakes caught in her hair like tiny diamonds. Mind the path, she said. It will be slippery now. Clara kissed her cheek. We'll come again soon. Perhaps next week, if the snow eases. I shall look forward to it. They walked away arm in arm, their figures gradually fading into the white dusk until only the glow of their lantern remained, bobbing gently along the lane. Miss Marple stood a moment longer at the gate, watching until the light disappeared around the bend. Then she turned back to the house, brushing snow from her shawl. Inside, she banked the fire, turned down the lamps one by one, and climbed the stairs to bed. Lying in the dark, listening to the faint hush of snow against the roof, she thought of the long thread that had begun with a single letter and ended. Not ended really, but continued in these quiet afternoons of tea and conversation. The spurned lover had found his place. the woman who had waited had learned to walk forward. The observer had watched it all unfold with the same calm satisfaction she felt now. Outside, the snow fell steadily, covering the gardens, the lanes, the two villages in the same soft white peace. Somewhere, a dog barked once, muffled and far away. A barn owl called from the old oak beyond the churchyard. Then silence again, deep, comforting, complete. Miss Marple closed her eyes. Tomorrow would bring more small things: tea to brew, knitting to finish, perhaps a letter from Clara with news of the greenhouse plans. Each day would arrive in its own time, gentle and unhurried, carrying its own small measure of contentment. And that, she thought as sleep began to gather, was enough. More than enough. Good night, dear listener. Let the snow cover your thoughts tonight, soft and quiet, until morning brings its own gentle light. May every unfinished story in your heart find its peaceful place, just as this one has.